Welcome to the listening room, a quiet place for long-form thought, calm exploration, and deep understanding. Settle in, and let's begin. When work became identity. For most of human history, work was something people did. It was an activity, a necessity, a rhythm of survival. People hunted, farmed, built, repaired, traded, and tended, not to define who they were, but to sustain life itself. Work was woven into existence, yet it did not stand in for meaning. Today, something has changed. When we meet someone new, one of the first questions we often ask is not about their values, their family, or their interests. We ask, "What do you do?" And we usually mean only one thing by that question. We mean, what is your job? This episode is about that shift. It is about how work, once a function of life, slowly became a substitute for identity. At its core, this subject is not about employment or economics alone. It is about how modern societies came to link worth, purpose, and legitimacy to productivity. It is about why many people feel uneasy when they are not working, anxious during rest, and uncertain about who they are without a role, title, or output to point to. Humans care deeply about this topic because identity is not optional. We all need a coherent story about who we are and why we matter. When traditional sources of identity, community, religion, lineage, shared rituals began to weaken, something had to take their place. Work quietly stepped into that vacuum. This matters in daily life in ways we often don't question. It shapes how we introduce ourselves, how we judge others, how we measure success, and how we interpret failure. It affects how we rest, how we age with illness, and how we experience retirement or unemployment. It even shapes how we grieve, because losing a job can feel psychologically like losing a self. The problem this topic helps us understand is subtle but widespread. Why so many people feel chronically busy yet existentially unfulfilled. Why burnout feels personal rather than structural. Why stepping away from work can provoke guilt instead of relief. To understand modern life clearly, we must understand how work became more than labor, how it became identity. This episode will show that work became identity not because humans suddenly valued labor more, but because modern societies slowly removed other stable sources of meaning, and work expanded to fill that void. By the end of this lecture, you will gain a clearer understanding of how this shift occurred historically, how it operates psychologically, and how it influences the way people think about themselves today. You will not be asked to reject work, nor to romanticize a past that no longer exists. Instead, the goal is perspective, to see work clearly, in proportion, and in context. What follows will be a calm exploration grounded in history, social change, and human behavior. We will move slowly, connect ideas carefully, and reflect thoughtfully, without urgency, without slogans, and without pressure to fix anything immediately. Chapter 1. Life before work was identity. To understand when work became identity, we must first understand a time when it was not. This chapter matters because it reminds us that the way we relate to work today is not inevitable. It is the result of specific historical conditions, not a universal human truth. In pre-industrial societies, work was embedded within life rather than separated from it. People did not go to work in the modern sense. They worked where they lived, among people they knew, often alongside family. Labor followed natural cycles: daylight, seasons, harvests, migrations, weather. Crucially, identity was distributed across multiple domains. A person was known as a parent, a neighbor, a member of a village, a participant in rituals, a bearer of tradition. Occupation mattered, but it did not dominate the self-concept. A farmer was not valuable because they farmed because the community needed food. Even language reflects this difference. Many cultures lacked a single word that directly translated to job as we understand it today. Work was an activity, not a label. Meaning came from belonging rather than achievement. Status came from age, wisdom, lineage, or contribution to shared survival, not from productivity metrics or individual performance. This structure limited the psychological weight placed on work. Failure in labor was often contextual rather than personal. A bad harvest was a communal problem, not a personal moral failing. Exhaustion was recognized as a signal to rest, not a weakness to overcome. Importantly, time itself was experienced differently. Without clocks governing labor, people lived by events rather than hours. There was effort and hardship, certainly, but not the constant internal pressure to justify one's existence through output. This matters because it reveals that identity once rested on continuity rather than optimization. You were someone because you belonged somewhere and participated in life's rhythms, not because you maximized efficiency. What this means for human behavior is profound. When work is not identity, rest does not require justification. Aging does not threaten worth. Illness does not imply failure. One's value persists even when productivity pauses. Understanding this earlier relationship to work allows us to recognize something important. The anxiety many people feel around work today is not simply personal insecurity. It is the result of asking work to do something it was never designed to do. Define the self. Before we continue, a gentle question for you as a listener. When you think about who you are, how much of that story is tied to what you do for work, and how much exists outside of it? In Chapter 2, we'll examine the historical turning point where this shift accelerated, the rise of industrial time, wage labor, and the separation of work from life. Chapter 2. When time replaced community. To understand how work moved from something people did into something people were, we need to examine a quiet but radical transformation, the reorganization of time itself. This shift did not begin with psychology, it began with clocks. For most of human history, time was experienced as fluid and situational. It followed daylight, seasons, and necessity. Work expanded and contracted naturally. People worked until the task was complete, not until a bell rang. There was effort, but there was also elasticity. The Industrial Revolution changed this relationship completely. Factories did not operate on seasons or sunlight. They operated on schedules. Machines required synchronization. Labor had to be standardized, predictable, and measurable. Time became abstract, divided into hours, minutes, shifts. Instead of work fitting into life, life began to fit around work. This change did more than restructure economies, it rewired how humans related to themselves. When wages became tied to hours, time itself became a commodity. A person no longer sold what they made, they sold slices of their life, 8 hours here, 12 hours there. Time that once belonged to family, rest, or reflection was now accounted for, tracked, and priced. This created a new internal equation. If my time has value only when it is productive, then my worth must be linked to how I use it. Over time, this idea became normalized. Being busy became virtuous. Idleness became suspicious. Rest required explanation. The question was no longer, did you contribute, but how much did you produce? As communities fractured under urbanization, another shift occurred. People no longer lived among extended families or lifelong neighbors. Identity based on place weakened. Religion and ritual lost cultural dominance in many regions. What remained consistent, structured, and socially recognized was work. Work became the most stable source of external validation. Titles replaced roles, performance replaced participation, evaluation replaced belonging. This was not imposed violently or suddenly, it happened gradually, over generations. Children grew up watching adults organize life around work schedules. Schools began preparing students not for citizenship or wisdom, but for employability. Punctuality, obedience, and productivity became moral traits rather than logistical ones. By the time people reached adulthood, the idea that work reflected character felt natural. Hard work meant you were good. Lack of work suggested failure. Overwork signaled commitment. None of this required conscious belief, it was absorbed through repetition. Psychologically, this produced a subtle shift. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" in relation to others, people began asking, "What do I do and how well do I do it?" Identity narrowed. It became easier to explain, but harder to sustain. When identity rests primarily on work, it becomes fragile. Jobs change, bodies age, industries disappear. And when work falters, the self trembles with it. This is why job loss can feel existential rather than practical. It is not only income that disappears, but narrative. The story a person tells themselves about who they are suddenly has missing pages. Modern societies rarely acknowledge this openly. Instead, individuals are encouraged to adapt, reskill, rebrand. The assumption is that identity should move seamlessly with employment. But psychologically, humans are not designed for that level of constant reinvention without strain. As work became the primary organizing principle of adult life, it also became the primary lens through which people judged themselves and others. Conversations narrowed, introductions shortened, complexity flattened. "I am what I do" became the unspoken default. And yet, something important was lost in this trade. When work absorbs identity, meaning becomes conditional. Worth must be earned repeatedly. Rest feels unsafe. Stillness feels like falling behind. Even leisure becomes optimized, measured, and displayed. This is not because people are weak or misguided. It is because identity, once spread across many supports, was placed onto a single pillar. And no single pillar, especially one tied to economic forces, can hold the full weight of a human life. We will continue tracing this evolution in the next section, where work not only structured time and identity, but began to promise something deeper: purpose, fulfillment, and even moral value. Chapter 3. When Work Promised Meaning. As work became the central structure of adult life, it began to take on a new role, one it had never fully occupied before. It no longer merely organized time or provided income. It began to promise meaning. This promise did not emerge accidentally. It arose at a moment when other sources of meaning were weakening. In many modern societies, religious authority declined or became privatized. Extended families fragmented, community rituals faded, shared narratives about duty, honor, and place lost their coherence. People still needed a reason to endure difficulty, to tolerate boredom, to justify sacrifice. Work quietly stepped into that role. The language around work changed. Jobs were no longer described simply as tasks, they became careers. Careers suggested direction, progression, and destiny. One was no longer simply earning a living, one was building something. The self became a project. This shift was psychologically powerful. If work could offer purpose, then effort could be justified not only economically, but morally. Long hours were no longer just necessary, they were meaningful. Sacrifice became a sign of depth. Struggle implied growth. But meaning is a heavy burden to place on labor. Historically, meaning came from participation in something larger than the self: community, tradition, shared fate. Modern work, however, is often individual, competitive, and unstable. It offers recognition selectively and withdraws it easily. This creates a paradox. People are encouraged to seek fulfillment through work, yet most work is not structured to provide it. The result is chronic dissatisfaction, accompanied by self-blame. When work feels empty, individuals assume something is wrong with them rather than with the promise itself. Psychologically, this produces over-identification. Instead of saying, "I do this work," people say, "I am this work." Success feels like validation of existence. Failure feels like exposure. Feedback becomes personal. Boundaries erode. Even jobs that once were considered means to an end are reframed as passions. People are encouraged to love what they do, even when the conditions make love unsustainable. When passion is demanded, exhaustion feels like betrayal, not of the employer, but of the self. This is why burnout often arrives quietly. It does not begin with collapse, it begins with loyalty. With saying yes one more time, with staying late because it feels meaningful to do so, with ignoring signals from the body because the work feels important. Over time, the nervous system adapts to constant demand. Rest feels uncomfortable. Stillness feels empty. Identity narrows further. Work becomes the primary source of structure, validation, and direction. When it goes well, it offers temporary stability. When it goes poorly, it threatens the self. This dynamic reshapes how people relate to time off. Vacations become recovery periods rather than enjoyment. Weekends feel shorter than they are. Even leisure is often narrated in terms of productivity, optimizing rest to return refreshed and effective. Meaning, once found in being, is replaced by meaning in doing. This transformation also alters how societies treat those who cannot work or who work in ways that are undervalued. Caregivers, the elderly, the disabled, the unemployed are often rendered invisible or morally suspect. Their worth is questioned not explicitly, but structurally. When work equals meaning, non-work becomes a problem to explain. This is not because modern people are cruel. It is because they are living inside a framework that equates contribution with output and output with worth. In the next section, we'll explore how this framework solidified into something even more personal, how work became not just meaningful, but moral. Chapter 4: When Work Became Moral. Once work began promising meaning, it did not stop there. Over time, it absorbed something even older and more powerful than purpose: morality. In earlier societies, moral judgment was tied to adherence to shared codes, religious commandments, communal norms, honor systems, mutual obligation. While these systems were imperfect, they located morality in behavior toward others rather than in productivity. Modern work culture gradually reframed this. Being good became associated with being industrious. Being responsible meant being employed. Being lazy shifted from a temporary state to a character flaw. These words carried moral weight, not just descriptive meaning. This transformation happened subtly, No single authority declared work a moral duty. Instead, moral language quietly attached itself to labor through repetition. Phrases like hard-working, self-made, earning your keep, and pulling your weight became markers of virtue. At the same time, economic systems grew more complex and impersonal. As people became less visible to one another as neighbors, they became legible primarily as workers. Contribution to society was measured indirectly through participation in the economy rather than through relationships. This made moral judgment easier, but also harsher. If worth is tied to work, then unemployment is not just unfortunate, it is suspicious. If success reflects virtue, then poverty implies failure. Structural forces disappear from view, replaced by narratives of individual responsibility. Psychologically, this creates constant self-surveillance. People monitor their own effort not just for results, but for moral adequacy. Am I doing enough? Am I working hard enough? Am I allowed to rest? These questions are rarely asked explicitly, but they shape internal experience. Guilt becomes a companion to rest. Anxiety accompanies downtime. Even illness can provoke shame because it interrupts productivity. This moralization of work also reshapes identity across the lifespan. Young people are urged to find direction early. Middle-aged adults fear stagnation. Older adults struggle with relevance after retirement. At every stage, worth appears conditional. Importantly, this system does not require external enforcement to function. Once internalized, people police themselves. They overwork without being asked. They apologize for resting. They explain their choices defensively, as if existence itself requires justification. This internalization is one of the most powerful and least visible features of modern work identity. It also explains why conversations about work are emotionally charged. Criticism of work culture can feel like criticism of character. Questioning productivity can feel like questioning morality. Yet this moral framing is historically recent. For most of human history, survival required labor, but morality required relationship. One could be a good person without being endlessly productive. One could be respected without being efficient. Modern societies collapsed these distinctions. The result is a moral economy where value fluctuates with output. People feel worthy when they're useful and uneasy when they're not. Identity rises and falls with performance. This has consequences not only for individuals, but for how societies respond to suffering. Burnout is treated as a personal issue. Unemployment is individualized. Exhaustion is normalized. When work is moral, questioning it feels dangerous. But understanding this transformation creates space for something else: discernment. Seeing morality attached to work allows us to ask whether it belongs there and what might happen if it did not. In the next section, we'll explore the psychological costs of this system and why so many people feel tired in ways that rest alone does not cure. Chapter 5: The Psychological Cost of Identity Through Work. When work carries time, meaning, and morality, it also carries the full psychological weight of the self. This is where the consequences become most intimate, felt not as ideas, but as exhaustion, anxiety, and quiet disorientation. To understand this cost, we need to begin with a simple observation. Identity is meant to be stable. Humans need a sense of continuity, a feeling that they remain themselves even as circumstances change. Work, however, is inherently unstable. Jobs end, roles shift, performance fluctuates, markets change, bodies age. When identity is anchored to something unstable, the nervous system never fully rests. This is why so many people feel perpetually on. Even outside working hours, the mind continues to evaluate, plan, rehearse, and assess. The internal voice asks, "Am I doing enough? Am I falling behind? Am I still valuable?" These questions are not pathological. They are logical responses to a system that ties worth to output. Over time, this creates a condition where rest becomes psychologically unsafe. Stillness removes the external signals, emails, tasks, progress that reassure the self. Without them, people feel unmoored. Silence can feel like emptiness. Time off can feel like drifting. This is one reason burnout is often misunderstood. Burnout is not simply fatigue from effort, it is identity overload. It occurs when a single role is asked to supply meaning, morality, stability, and self-worth simultaneously. No role can sustain that demand. As exhaustion accumulates, people often respond by trying harder. They optimize routines, seek efficiency, consume advice. The underlying assumption remains unchallenged. If I manage myself better, this will feel better. But the discomfort is not primarily a management problem. It is a structural one. When identity depends on performance, failure becomes personal. Mistakes feel exposing. Criticism penetrates deeply. Even success brings only temporary relief because it must be repeated to maintain worth. This creates emotional volatility. Confidence rises and falls with external validation. People become sensitive to metrics, ratings, reviews, promotions, comparisons. The self becomes porous. At the same time, work identity narrows emotional range. Feelings that do not serve productivity, grief, uncertainty, ambivalence, are suppressed or postponed. There is no time to feel them. Over time, this can produce emotional flattening. People function well, but feel distant from themselves. Relationships also change under this pressure. Conversations revolve around schedules, demands, and achievements. Presence becomes partial. Attention fragments. Even moments of connection can feel rushed. Importantly, this cost is often invisible from the outside. People appear competent, successful, composed. Internally, however, many carry a quiet sense of fragility, an awareness that if work were removed, something essential would collapse. This fear is rarely articulated. It sits beneath the surface, influencing choices. People stay in unhealthy roles. They avoid transitions. They tolerate misalignment, not because they love the work, but because they fear the void behind it. And yet the irony remains. Work was never meant to hold the self together. It was meant to serve life, not replace it. When identity becomes overly concentrated in work, the psyche adapts in ways that preserve function at the expense of depth. People survive, but they do not fully settle. They remain alert, vigilant, unfinished. This is not a failure of resilience, it is a signal. In the final section, we will step back from diagnosis and move towards perspective, examining what changes when work is returned to its proper scale, and how identity can become more spacious without rejecting effort, ambition, or responsibility. We will not rush this. We will simply widen the frame. Conclusion. Returning work to its proper size. We have spent this time tracing a slow transformation rather than a sudden rupture. Nothing about this story hinges on a single invention, policy, or generation. Work did not become identity overnight. It accumulated meaning gradually, quietly, almost politely, as other sources of identity weakened or disappeared. We began by noticing that work was once an activity embedded within life, not a definition of the self. It was necessary, often difficult, but rarely asked to answer existential questions. Belonging, continuity, and worth were distributed across family, community, ritual, and shared fate. Then we followed the reorganization of time itself, how industrial schedules, wage labor, and clock-based productivity separated work from life and elevated it into the primary organizing force of adulthood. As communities fragmented, work remained stable, legible, and socially rewarded. It became the easiest answer to the question of who someone was. From there, work began to promise more than structure. It promised meaning. Careers replaced vocations. Identity became something to build, optimize, and advance. Effort was no longer only practical, it was personal. When fulfillment failed to arrive, individuals blamed themselves rather than the promise. Then work absorbed morality. Industriousness became virtue. Rest required justification. Productivity was confused with goodness. People learned to evaluate themselves continually, even in silence. Worth became conditional, fluctuating with output. And finally, we examined the psychological cost of asking work to hold the self together. When identity is anchored to something unstable, the nervous system never fully rests. Burnout emerges not from weakness, but from overload. Rest feels unsafe. Stillness feels empty. Life becomes narrow without necessarily becoming meaningless, just constrained. Seen together, these patterns reveal something important. The problem is not work itself. The problem is scale. Work grew larger than it was meant to be. It expanded to fill gaps it did not create and cannot sustain. It became identity by default, not because it was the best suited for the role, but because other structures receded. Understanding this changes perspective in a subtle but powerful way. It allows work to be seen clearly again, not as an enemy, not as a savior, but one domain of life among others, necessary, valuable, limited. When work is returned to its proper scale, something loosens internally. Rest no longer threatens worth. Transitions become survivable. Aging does not erase value. Periods of uncertainty do not erase identity. This does not require abandoning effort, ambition, or contribution. It requires remembering that no single role can contain a human being. Identity becomes more resilient when it is wider than performance. Meaning becomes more durable when it is not tied exclusively to output. Life becomes more humane when worth is not constantly at stake. This knowledge does not demand immediate change. It invites reflection. It asks the listener to notice, not judge, how much weight work carries in their own inner life and whether that weight feels proportional. And perhaps over time, it allows a different question to emerge, one quieter and less urgent than "what do you do?" Something closer to "who are you?" even when nothing is being produced. This has been The Listening Room, a space for clarity, patience, and understanding. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for listening.